Welcome. Imagine standing at the edge of the Yellow River on a morning 4,000 years before the present day. The water is the color of pale clay, heavy with loess carried down from the highlands of the northwest. The plain ahead of you stretches without horizon. And somewhere in that flatness, in those reed-edged villages of rammed earth and painted pottery, the longest continuous civilization in human history is quietly beginning to breathe. This is China, not a nation born in a single revolution, not an empire forged in one decisive century, but a civilization that has been building, breaking, and rebuilding itself for more than 5,000 years without ever truly disappearing. That is the question that drives everything you are about to witness. How does a civilization survive that long? What ideas, what institutions, what stubborn human will carries a people through the collapse of dynasty after dynasty, through invasion and famine and revolution and transformation, and still allows them to look at their own writing system and recognize it as their own after 3,000 years of continuous use? The story you are about to follow is not a fragment, it is the complete arc. From the Yangshao farmers pressing spiral patterns into clay vessels along the Wei River, to the Shang kings at Anyang pressing hot bronze into oracle bones to ask their ancestors whether to go to war. From Qin Shi Huang unifying 7 warring kingdoms in 221 before Christ and declaring himself the first emperor, to the Han Dynasty stretching its reach across Central Asia along the routes we now call the Silk Road. From the golden streets of Tang Dynasty Chang'an, the largest city on earth, crowded with Persian merchants and Buddhist monks and poets composing verse in tea-house gardens, to the Song Dynasty's astonishing commercial revolution that gave the world paper money, gunpowder weapons, and the magnetic compass centuries before Europe imagined them. And then the harder chapters. The Mongol conquest. The Ming dynasty's extraordinary isolation after Zheng He's treasure fleets crossed the Indian Ocean. The Qing dynasty's collision with Western gunboats in the 1840s, the unequal treaties, the loss of Hong Kong, the Taiping rebellion that killed 20 million people, the slow unraveling of 2,000 years of imperial order, ending on a February morning in 1912, when a child emperor named Puyi signed his abdication, and the dragon throne stood empty for the first time in recorded memory. And still the story did not end. It transformed. Through revolution and civil war and Japanese invasion and the long march across 9,000 kilometers of mountain and steppe. Through Mao Zedong's proclamation in Tiananmen Square on the 1st of October 1949, through the catastrophic suffering of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and then through Deng Xiaoping's quiet revolution after 1978, which lifted 400 million people from poverty and rebuilt China into the world's second-largest economy within a single human lifetime. That story is still unfolding. The civilization that invented paper and printing and gunpowder now leads the world in high-speed rail, renewable energy, and quantum communication research. The weight of 5,000 years does not slow it. It shapes it. If you are drawn to complete journeys through the rise and transformation of the world's great civilizations, please subscribe so you do not miss a single step of this exploration. Each week we bring you the full story of a world that made history. Now let us begin this journey. The Yellow River moves slowly here, near its upper reaches, carrying the color of the earth it has carved through for 10,000 years. The water is heavy with loess, that fine wind-blown soil that coats the plateaus of Shanxi and Henan in layers dozens of meters deep. In the early morning light, the river's surface catches the pale gold of a sun still low on the horizon, and the land around it stretches wide and flat, broken only by distant ridge lines and the dark lines of seasonal drainage channels cutting through the plain. This is where it begins, not with kings or armies, not with bronze or iron, with soil, water, and the slow accumulation of human knowledge about how to live within a landscape that gives generously and takes without warning. Around 7,000 years before the Common Era, small communities were already gathering along the middle reaches of the Yellow River and its tributaries. They built in wood and earth, constructing semi-subterranean roundhouses, whose walls were packed with rammed loess, and whose roofs were supported by timber posts set deep into the ground. The floors were smoothed and sometimes plastered. Hearths burned at the center. Outside, the fields were narrow and carefully tended, planted with millet, a grain that tolerated the dry northern climate and the unpredictable rhythms of rainfall across the Loess Plateau. By 5,000 years before the Common Era, the culture archaeologists call Yangshao had spread across a wide arc of territory centered in modern Shanxi and Henan provinces. Yangshao villages were not small. Some covered dozens of hectares, surrounded by ditches that marked communal boundaries and offered modest protection. Inside these settlements, pottery was being made with a sophistication that still commands attention. The vessels were hand-built and kiln-fired, painted in bold geometric patterns, spirals, fish, human faces rendered in red and black pigment on burnished orange clay. These were not purely functional objects. They carried meaning. They were placed in graves alongside the dead, suggesting beliefs about what followed life and what the living owed to those who had passed. The Yangshao world was not uniform. Regional variations in pottery style, house construction, and burial practice reveal a mosaic of communities sharing broad cultural patterns while developing distinct local identities. Across this landscape, the foundations of what would become a recognizable Chinese agricultural tradition were being laid. The cultivation of millet and later rice, the keeping of pigs and dogs, the organization of labor around the rhythms of planting and harvest. Further east, along the lower Yellow River and into the Shandong Peninsula, a distinct tradition was emerging. The Longshan culture, flourishing between roughly 3,000 and 2,000 years before the Common Era, produced pottery of extraordinary technical refinement. Longshan black burnished ware, thin-walled, wheel-thrown, fired to a deep, lustrous black, represents one of the most technically demanding ceramic achievements of the ancient world. The walls of some vessels are barely 3 millimeters thick, yet they hold their form with perfect precision. Longshan settlements were larger and more formally organized than their Yangshao predecessors. Rammed earth walls enclosed residential and ceremonial spaces. Evidence of social stratification appears in burial assemblages. Some graves contain jade objects, bronze precursors, and prestige goods that others do not. Marks scratched onto pottery vessels hint at early symbolic notation, though whether these represent true proto-writing or simpler ownership marks remains a question scholars continue to examine. To the south, along the Yangtze River Delta, the Liangzhu culture was producing jade of breathtaking quality. By discs, flat circular rings of polished nephrite, and Kong tubes, square-sectioned cylinders with circular bores, were crafted with tools that should not, by any conventional measure, have been capable of such precision. These objects were buried with the dead in quantities that signal enormous social investment. They were not ornaments alone. They were instruments of ritual, markers of authority, connections to a cosmological order that the living sought to maintain and honor. Across these river valleys and coastal plains, the legendary memory of early Chinese civilization would later crystallize around the figures of the sage kings, Yao, Shun, and Yu, rulers whose names encoded ideals of moral governance, flood management, and the proper ordering of human society. Yu the Great, credited with taming the catastrophic floods of the Yellow River through years of tireless labor, became the founding ancestor of the semi-legendary Zhou Dynasty. Whether the Zhou represents a historical state or a later cultural memory remains debated. But the landscape that produced these stories, the flooding river, the fertile plain, the communities dependent on collective water management, is entirely real. It shaped everything that followed. The earth at Anyang holds its secrets in layers. Beneath the flat agricultural fields of modern Henan province, beneath the roots of winter wheat and the compressed soil of 3,000 years, lie the foundations of a civilization that crossed from legend into documented history. Here, along the banks of the Huan River, a tributary of the Yellow, the Shang Dynasty established its final and most powerful capital, a city the ancient texts called Yin. What archaeology has recovered from this ground transformed the understanding of Chinese origins entirely. The Zhou Dynasty, whose memory the later Zhou historians preserved with reverence, remains archaeologically elusive. Its kings appear in genealogical lists. Its founding by Yu the Great, the flood tamer, anchors the earliest chapters of Chinese dynastic tradition. But the material evidence that would confirm a centralized Xia state continues to be debated. What is not debated is what came after. Around 1600 years before the Common Era, a new political order emerged in the Yellow River Basin, one whose physical remains are abundant, whose writing survives, and whose influence on Chinese civilization proved permanent. The Shang dynasty did not appear without precedent. It grew from the same agricultural world that had produced the Longshan walled settlements, the same reverence for ancestors that had shaped Neolithic ritual life. But the Shang transformed these inheritances into something qualitatively new. At the center of Shang power stood the king, not merely a military leader or a village elder, but a sacred intermediary between the living world and the realm of royal ancestors whose approval governed every significant decision. It is in the oracle bones that this relationship becomes visible. Flat pieces of cattle, shoulder bone, and turtle plastron, heated with a bronze rod until they cracked, then read by trained diviners who interpreted the pattern of fractures as ancestral responses to royal questions. Would the harvest be abundant? Would the military campaign succeed? Would the queen give birth safely? Each question was carved into the bone in a script of extraordinary sophistication, a writing system using hundreds of distinct characters, combining pictographic, ideographic, and phonetic elements in ways that directly anticipate the Chinese characters still written today. Over 150,000 oracle bone fragments have been recovered from Anyang alone, representing a royal archive of divination records spanning generations of Shang kings. The bronze vessels that accompanied Shang ritual life speak a different but equally powerful language. Cast using piece mold techniques of remarkable precision, these vessels, the massive Ding cauldrons standing on 3 legs, the Zhou wine cups with their elegant tripod bases, the Yu containers with their animal mask decorations, were not decorative objects. They were instruments of sacred communication, used in elaborate feasts offered to royal ancestors, filled with grain wine and sacrificial meat, placed before altar platforms in rammed earth temples where the boundary between living and dead grew thin. The reign of King Wu Ding, approximately 1250 to 1192 years before the Common Era, represents the most thoroughly documented period of Shang power. His oracle bone inscriptions record military campaigns against surrounding peoples, agricultural divinations, ritual schedules, and the activities of his consort Fu Hao, a woman whose tomb, discovered intact in 1976, contained over 1,600 bronze objects, jade carvings, and bone artifacts, confirming her role as both a military commander and a ritual specialist of the highest rank. Beneath the palace foundations at Anyang, archaeologists uncovered the darker dimensions of Shang kingship. Royal burials of extraordinary scale, with wooden tomb chambers descending into the earth through ramps cut from 4 directions, contained not only bronze vessels and jade goods, but the remains of sacrificed humans and horses, chariots buried complete with their drivers, and the skulls of decapitated captives arranged in ritual patterns. The Shang world was one in which the boundary between power and violence, between devotion and coercion, was never far from the surface. Yet from this world came the writing system that would outlast every dynasty, every conquest, every political transformation China would ever experience. The characters carved into oracle bones at Anyang are recognizable ancestors of the characters written in Shanghai and Beijing today. In this continuity lies something remarkable, a thread of cultural memory stretching across more than 3,000 years, connecting the diviners of a Bronze Age kingdom to the civilization that inherited everything they began. The Zhou armies move westward in the year 1046 before the Common Era, crossing the Yellow River under banners that carry the claim of a new, heaven-sanctioned order. At the Battle of Muye, on a plain north of the Shang capital, King Wu of Zhou meets the last Shang forces and defeats them decisively. The Shang king, according to later accounts, sets fire to his own palace and perishes within it. A dynasty that had endured for more than 5 centuries ends in a single afternoon of battle. What follows is not simply a change of rulers. It is the introduction of an idea that will govern Chinese political thought for 3,000 years. King Wu and his advisors articulate what later generations will call the mandate of heaven, the belief that the right to rule flows from a moral authority granted by the heavens themselves. A dynasty that governs justly retains this mandate. A dynasty that becomes corrupt, cruel, or incompetent loses it. Natural disasters, peasant rebellions, and military defeats become signs that heaven has withdrawn its approval. This concept does not merely justify the Zhou conquest. It creates a framework through which every future dynasty will explain its own rise and interpret every dynasty's fall. The Zhou feudal order spreads across the North China plain through a system of granted territories. King Wu and his successors enfeoff relatives, allies, and loyal subordinates as lords of regional states, each obligated to provide military service, tribute, and ritual acknowledgement of Zhou supremacy. Over 170 such states eventually exist, their walled capitals rising from the loess soil, their bronze vessels inscribed with records of royal grants and ancestral obligations. The Zhou king sits at the center of this web, performing the great ritual sacrifices that maintain the cosmic order connecting heaven, earth, and human society. For nearly 3 centuries, the Western Zhou holds this arrangement together. Then, in 771 before the Common Era, nomadic Quanrong raiders sack the Zhou capital at Hao, near modern Xi'an, killing King Yu. The court retreats eastward to Luoyang, and what historians call the Eastern Zhou begins. The Zhou kings retain their ritual prestige, but their practical authority drains away. Regional lords grow stronger, more independent, more willing to pursue their own ambitions without reference to the weakened royal house. The spring and autumn period, from 771 to 476 before the Common Era, sees powerful states like Qi, Jin, Chu, and Qin rise to dominance, each claiming the role of hegemon, the strong state that enforces order among the others in the Zhou king's name. The rituals of deference continue, but the reality of power has shifted irrevocably. Iron tools spread through agriculture during these centuries, increasing crop yields and supporting larger populations. Iron weapons and cavalry begin replacing the bronze-armed chariot armies of the Shang and early Zhou, transforming the character of warfare itself. It is within this world of fracturing order and intensifying competition that China's greatest philosophical tradition is born. In the small state of Lu, in 551 before the Common Era, a man named Kong Qiu is born into a family of minor nobility. He will become known to history as Kongzi and to the wider world as Confucius. He travels from state to state, seeking a ruler willing to implement his vision of governance grounded in ritual propriety, benevolence, and the cultivation of moral character. No ruler fully embraces his program during his lifetime, but his conversations, recorded by disciples in the text known as the Analects, establish the foundations of a philosophical tradition that will shape Chinese civilization more profoundly than any military conquest. Confucius is not alone in this age of intellectual ferment. Laozi, whose precise historical identity remains uncertain, is credited with composing the Tao Te Ching, a text of 81 short chapters exploring the nature of the Tao, the way underlying all existence, and counseling a governance of minimal intervention and natural harmony. Sunzi composes the art of war on bamboo strips around 500 before the Common Era, producing a treatise on strategy and deception that military thinkers will study for 2.5 millennia. Mencius develops Confucian thought further, arguing that human nature is fundamentally good and that rulers who fail their people forfeit their right to rule. Han Feizi synthesizes legalist philosophy, arguing that only strict law, clear rewards, and severe punishments can maintain order in a world where human nature cannot be trusted. By 350 before the Common Era, only 7 major states remain from the hundreds that once populated the Zhou world. Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, and Qin compete in what historians call the Warring States period, an era of near-constant military conflict, diplomatic maneuvering, and radical political experimentation. States adopt new administrative structures, abolish old aristocratic privileges, and recruit officials on the basis of ability rather than birth. The walls of Qi and Chu stretch for hundreds of kilometers. Armies number in the hundreds of thousands. The scale of violence escalates with each generation. It is from this crucible of competition, philosophical questioning, and institutional innovation that the next transformation will emerge, one that will end the Zhou world entirely and replace it with something no one in the age of Confucius could have fully imagined. The state of Qin sits at the western edge of the known world, pressed against the Loess highlands of the Wei River Valley, bordered by mountains on 3 sides and open to the central plains on the 4th. For centuries, the other 6 states regard Qin as a rough frontier kingdom, more warrior than scholar, more practical than refined. They are not entirely wrong, but it is precisely this quality, the willingness to discard tradition when tradition becomes an obstacle, that will make Qin the instrument of history's most consequential transformation. The reforms begin a century before unification. The minister Shang arrives in Qin around 350 before the Common Era and restructures the state from its foundations. Aristocratic privilege is stripped away. Land is redistributed. Military rank is awarded not by birth, but by the number of enemy heads taken in battle. The state becomes a machine, rational, hierarchical, and relentless. Farmers grow grain. Soldiers fight wars. Officials administer. Everything serves the expansion of Qin power. By the time the young King Zheng ascends the throne in 246 before the Common Era, he inherits a state already primed for conquest. He is 13 years old at his accession. By his mid-20s, he begins the final campaign. In 230 before the Common Era, Qin armies move against Han, the smallest and weakest of the remaining states. Han falls within a year. Zhou follows in 228, Wei in 225. Chu, the largest southern state, resists fiercely but collapses in 223. Yan falls in 222. Qi, the last holdout, surrenders without a major battle in 221 before the Common Era. 9 years, 6 kingdoms. A unified empire stretching from the Yellow River Basin to the Yangtze Valley and beyond. King Zheng does not consider existing titles adequate for what he has accomplished. He combines the ancient terms for divine sage king, Huang, and supreme ruler, Dai, into a new title, Qin Shi Huang, the first august emperor. He declares that his successors will follow in sequence, the second emperor, the third, for 10,000 generations. The dynasty will last 15 years. But the ambition reshapes the world regardless of its brevity. The first emperor imposes a single writing system across the empire, the small seal script, replacing the divergent regional scripts that had fragmented written communication for centuries. Weights and measures are standardized. Bronze coinage is unified. Even the axle widths of carts are regulated, so that roads worn into the earth by wheels can be used uniformly across the empire. A network of imperial roads radiates outward from the capital, at Xianyang, covering over 6,000 kilometers, connecting the frontier garrisons to the administrative center. To the north, the walls built by Yan, Zhou, and Qin against nomadic incursions are connected and extended into an early version of what will eventually become the Great Wall. Hundreds of thousands of laborers, conscripts, convicts, and soldiers work the mountain ridgelines of the northern frontier. The Link Canal is cut through the mountains of the south, linking the Yangtze and Pearl River systems and allowing Qin armies to supply campaigns into what is now Guangdong and Guangxi. The first emperor does not trust the past. Books containing history, philosophy, and poetry outside of Qin's approved canon are ordered burned in 213 before the Common Era. Scholars who resist or who preserve forbidden texts face execution. The burning of books and the burying of scholars, as later tradition will describe it, represents the most dramatic assertion of ideological control the ancient world has yet witnessed. Beneath the hills outside Xianyang, the emperor's mausoleum grows for decades. An entire underground palace is constructed, its rivers of mercury flowing through carved channels, its ceiling mapped with constellations. And surrounding the burial complex, arranged in precise military formation, stand thousands of terracotta warriors, each face distinct, each figure once painted in vivid pigments of red, green, and black, standing guard over an emperor who believed death itself could be administered like a province. The first emperor dies in 210 before the Common Era, on an inspection tour far from the capital. Within 4 years, the empire he built through a lifetime of conquest dissolves into rebellion. The roads that carried his armies now carry insurgents. The administrative machinery that unified the empire becomes the instrument of its own overthrow. Qin collapses in 206 before the Common Era. But the idea survives. The unified empire, the standardized script, the centralized administration. These do not disappear with the dynasty. They become the inheritance of every ruler who follows, the template against which all future claims to legitimate power in China will be measured. The inheritance of Qin does not wait long for a claimant. From the chaos of rebellion and collapsing order, a man of modest origins rises to claim the empire. Liu Bang, a minor official from the state of Chu, defeats his great rival Xiang Yu at the Battle of Gaixia in 202 before the Common Era. Where Qin ruled through fear and rigid law, Liu Bang understands something different. He reduces taxes, releases enslaved laborers, and allows the exhausted population of the North China Plain to breathe again. He calls his dynasty the Han. The capital rises at Chang'an, near the old Qin heartland along the Wei River. Its grid of wide avenues and walled market districts fills with merchants, officials, and craftsmen. Silk workshops operate in the eastern quarters, where weavers at draw looms produce bolts of fabric so fine they catch the light like water. Lacquerware workshops turn out bowls and trays coated in layers of red and black resin, each piece requiring dozens of separate applications before it reaches the hands of a buyer. The city grows into one of the largest urban centers on Earth, its population swelling toward 250,000 people within its walls alone. The dynasty's philosophical transformation comes gradually. The early Han emperors govern with a light hand, drawing on Taoist ideas of minimal interference. But under Emperor Wu, who reigns from 141 to 87 before the Common Era, Confucianism becomes the official ideology of the state. The Imperial Academy, the Tai Shui, trained scholars in the classical texts. Officials are selected through examination in the Confucian canon, rather than purely through aristocratic connection. The template is imperfect and incomplete by later standards, but the direction is set. Governance and learning become inseparable in the Chinese imagination. Emperor Wu also looks outward. The Xiongnu Confederacy on the northern steppe has long extracted tribute from Han rulers too weak to resist. Emperor Wu reverses this relationship through decades of costly military campaigns, pushing Han cavalry deep into the Gobi and beyond. To find allies against the Xiongnu, he sends the diplomat Zhang Qian westward in 138 before the Common Era. Zhang Qian travels for over a decade, reaching Bactria and the edges of the Parthian world. He returns not with the military alliance he sought, but with something more durable, knowledge of the roots, peoples, and goods that connect China to the far west. The Silk Road does not spring into existence at a single moment, but Zhang Qian's missions open the arteries through which silk, glass, spices, and ideas will flow for centuries. The Mawangdui tombs, sealed in the early Han period in modern Hunan province, preserve what time normally destroys. Silk manuscripts record medical texts, cosmological diagrams, and philosophical treatises. A noblewoman's body survives 2,000 years in remarkable condition, wrapped in layers of silk and lacquered coffins. These tombs are not monuments to power alone. They are archives of a civilization's inner life, its understanding of the body, the cosmos, and the proper ordering of human existence. The Han Dynasty does not move in a single unbroken line. Wang Mang, a reformist official, seizes power in the year 9 of the Common Era, interrupting the dynasty with his short-lived Qin interregnum. He attempts sweeping land reforms that alienate the powerful families who sustain the imperial order. By 23 of the Common Era, rebellion has swept him away. The Han restores itself, moving its capital eastward to Luoyang, beginning the period historians call the Eastern Han. Paper, invented under the court official Kai Lun around 105 of the Common Era, begins its slow transformation of how knowledge moves through the empire. Cheaper and lighter than silk, more durable than bamboo strips, paper carries administrative records, literary texts, and official correspondence across a realm that now stretches from the Korean peninsula to the edges of Central Asia, from the Mongolian steppe to the rice paddies of northern Vietnam. But the Eastern Han grows brittle. Great land-owning families accumulate power the court cannot check. Eunuch factions and Confucian officials wage bitter struggles within the palace. In 184 of the Common Era, the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupts across the North China plain, its followers wearing yellow headbands and promising a new cosmic age. The Han armies suppress the rebellion, but the regional commanders who do the suppressing never fully return their power to the throne. By 220 of the Common Era, the last Han emperor abdicates, and the unified empire fractures into 3 competing kingdoms. 4 centuries of Han order dissolve into the landscape, leaving behind a name that the Chinese people will carry as their own identity across every dynasty that follows. The Yangtze River does not pause for the collapse of dynasties. Its current moves southward through gorges and floodplains with the same indifference it has always carried. And in the years following the Han dissolution, 3 powers arrange themselves around its banks and across the northern plains, like pieces of a broken vessel that no longer fit together. In the north, the Kingdom of Wei inherits the administrative machinery of the old Han court. Its founder, Cao Pi, son of the brilliant and ruthless Cao Tao, declares himself emperor in 220 of the Common Era. To the southwest, in the Sichuan basin ringed by mountains that make it a world apart, the kingdom of Shu Han rises under the banner of Han restoration. To the southeast, commanding the lower Yangtze and the fertile lands of Jiangnan, the kingdom of Wu consolidates its power behind the natural barrier of the great river itself. 3 capitals, 3 courts, 3 armies, and between them, decades of exhausting warfare that drains the population of the North China Plain and scatters farming communities across the landscape. The Battle of Red Cliffs, fought in 208 of the Common Era before the formal division, already foretells the logic of this fragmentation. Cao Cao's northern fleet, chained together against the river's motion, burns in a catastrophe that halts southern expansion for a generation. The Yangtze becomes a frontier as much as a river. In 280 of the Common Era, the Qin Dynasty briefly stitches the 3 kingdoms back together. The unification lasts less than 40 years. Internal succession struggles tear the Qin court apart in the War of the 8 Princes, and the northern frontier, long held by Han military power, begins to give way. Xiongnu, Xianbei, Jie, Di, and Qiang peoples, many of whom have lived within the empire's borders for generations, move into the power vacuum. In 316 of the Common Era, Qin loses its northern capital at Luoyang, then its secondary capital at Chang'an. The court retreats south across the Yangtze to Jiankang, the city that will one day become Nanjing, and the north enters a period of fragmentation so violent and complex that historians will count 16 successive kingdoms rising and falling across its plains over the following century. Northern China in this era is a landscape of fortified towns, refugee columns, and competing cavalry armies. Yet within this violence, something unexpected takes root. Buddhist missionaries moving along the old Silk Road routes find audiences among rulers seeking legitimacy beyond the Confucian frameworks they have not fully inherited. At Yungang, in the sandstone cliffs of Shaanxi province, Northern Wei craftsmen carve enormous Buddha figures into the rock face, their features blending Central Asian and Chinese artistic traditions into something entirely new. At Longmen, near Luoyang, the carving continues across generations, producing thousands of niches filled with bodhisattvas and guardian figures that gaze outward from the stone with an expression of absolute stillness. The Northern Wei dynasty, founded by the Tuoba clan of the Xianbei people, gradually adopts Chinese administrative language, Chinese surnames, and Chinese court ritual. The boundary between conqueror and conquered blurs across 2 generations of deliberate cultural transformation. Meanwhile, south of the Yangtze, a succession of short-lived Chinese dynasties preserves the literary and philosophical traditions of the Han world, producing landscape poetry, calligraphy theory, and philosophical commentary that will shape Chinese culture for centuries. Reunification comes not from the south, but from the northwest. In 589 of the Common Era, the Sui dynasty under Emperor Wen defeats the last southern kingdom and brings the entire Chinese world under a single administration for the first time in nearly 4 centuries. The achievement is immense. His successor, Emperor Yangdi, pushes further, ordering the construction of the Grand Canal, a waterway system linking the Yellow River to the Yangtze and extending towards the Huai River basin, completed by 609 of the Common Era. Grain, silk, and soldiers can now move between north and south along a continuous artificial channel stretching over 2,000 kilometers. The canal will outlast the dynasty that built it by more than 1,000 years. But the Sui overreaches. 3 massive military campaigns against the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo drain the treasury and exhaust the armies. Peasant rebellions ignite across the North China Plain. In 618 of the Common Era, the Sui dynasty collapses, leaving behind its canal, its administrative reforms, and the reunified territorial foundation upon which a new and far more enduring dynasty will now build. The man who inherits the Sui collapse is Li Yuan, a northern aristocrat with Turkic connections and military experience along the frontier. In 618 of the Common Era, he enters the capital at Chang'an and declares a new dynasty. He calls it Tang. What follows will become one of the most celebrated eras in the long history of Chinese civilization, a period of territorial expansion, cosmopolitan culture, and artistic achievement that later generations will measure all other ages against. Chang'an under the Tang is the largest city on earth. Its grid of wide avenues divides the capital into ordered wards, each enclosed by its own walls and gates. At the city's heart stands the imperial palace complex, its vermilion columns and glazed tile rooftops rising above the surrounding plain. The population swells toward 1 million souls, merchants, officials, monks, soldiers, poets, and foreign visitors drawn from every corner of the known world. The West Market alone contains over 200 categories of trade, its stalls and workshops occupied by Sogdian merchants from Samarkand, Persian silversmiths, Arab traders carrying spices and glassware, and Nestorian Christian clergy maintaining their own church within the city walls. Emperor Taizong, who consolidates power in 626 of the Common Era after a palace coup against his own brothers, proves to be among the most capable rulers in Chinese history. He governs with a combination of military force and administrative restraint, surrounding himself with advisors who are permitted to challenge his decisions. Under his reign, which lasts until 649, Tang armies push westward into Central Asia, northward against the eastern Turkic Khaganate, and eastward toward the Korean peninsula. The Silk Road reopens under Tang protection. Caravans move again across the Taklamakan Desert, carrying silk westward and returning with gold, horses, and ideas. The Buddhist monk Xuanzang departs Chang'an in 629, traveling overland through Central Asia to India in search of original scriptures. He returns 16 years later carrying hundreds of texts, and his journey will eventually inspire one of the greatest works of Chinese literature. His pilgrimage reflects the Tang world's appetite for knowledge that crosses borders. Empress Wu Zetian, who rises from imperial consort to sole ruler, governs from 690 to 705, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. She expands the examination system, promotes officials based on talent rather than aristocratic birth, and maintains Tang power at its administrative peak. The reign of Emperor Xuanzong in the early 8th century brings Tang culture to its highest expression. The imperial court becomes a center of poetry, music, and painting. Li Bai composes verse of wild, visionary energy. Du Fu writes with moral weight and human compassion. Their poems will be memorized by Chinese school children for more than 1,000 years. Then, in 755 of the Common Era, a military commander of Sogdian and Turkic origin named An Lushan launches a rebellion from the northeastern frontier. His armies capture Luoyang and then Chang'an itself. The emperor flees southward. The rebellion that follows, lasting until 763, tears through the most populated regions of the empire. Estimates of the dead reach 36 million. The Tang dynasty survives, but the world it returns to is diminished. Provincial military governors consolidate independent power. The central government never fully reasserts control. The Golden Age does not end in a single moment, but in the slow withdrawal of a light that once illuminated the center of the world. The light that withdraws from Chang'an does not leave China in darkness. It moves. It shifts southward and eastward, settling into river cities and canal towns where merchants count coins by lamplight and craftsmen press ink onto paper in workshops that never fully sleep. The collapse of Tang central authority creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum flows commerce. After a brief period of fragmentation known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, a military commander named Zhou Kuangyin consolidates power and founds the Song Dynasty in 960 of the Common Era. He does so not through the brutal legalist machinery of Qin or the steppe cavalry of Tang frontier campaigns, but through negotiation, institutional reform, and a deliberate elevation of civil governance over military power. The scholar replaces the soldier at the center of Song political life. The examination hall becomes more important than the parade ground. The northern Song capital at Kaifeng sits at the junction of the Grand Canal and the Yellow River, and this geography is not accidental. Kaifeng breathes through waterways. Grain barges arrive from the south. Merchants from across the empire crowd its markets. The painter Zhang Zeduan captures this world in a single scroll, along the river during the Qingming festival, and what he records is not a court or a battlefield, but a city in motion. Boatmen hauling cargo under a rainbow bridge, street vendors arranging wares on wooden stalls, officials on horseback threading through crowds of ordinary people, buying, selling, and moving through a world organized around exchange. Song China produces innovations that will reshape human civilization. Movable type printing, developed by B. Sheng around 1040 of the Common Era, allows books to multiply at a speed no previous society has achieved. The compass, refined for maritime navigation during the Song period, will eventually guide European ships across oceans. Gunpowder, known since the Tang era, is now weaponized systematically. Fire bombs, fire arrows, and early cannons appear in Song military arsenals. At the Battle of Kaishi in 1161 of the Common Era, Song paddle-wheel warships deploy gunpowder bombs against a Jurchen-Jin fleet on the Yangtze, holding the river line against an enemy that has already taken the north, because the north has fallen. In 1127, Jurchen-Jin cavalry capture Kaifeng and take Emperor Huizong and his son prisoner, a catastrophe known as the Jingkang Incident. The Song court retreats southward, establishing a new capital at Lin'an, the city that will become Hangzhou. The southern Song period that follows is not simply a diminished rump state. It is one of the wealthiest societies the medieval world has ever produced. Song gross domestic product is estimated at roughly 30% of total global output. The population exceeds 100 million. Iron and steel production in Hebei furnaces surpasses levels that Europe will not reach until the 18th century. Linen surrounds Westlake with merchant districts, tea houses, pleasure boats, and academies where scholars debate Neo-Confucian philosophy under Zhu Xi's systematic framework. Paper money, the jiaozi and later the huizi, circulates through an economy too large and too complex for copper coins alone to serve. Maritime trade through the ports of Quanzhou and Guangzhou connects Song China to Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa. Chinese ceramics, silk, and copper coins flow outward. Spices, ivory, and tropical woods flow inward. But the world beyond the Yangtze is changing in ways that no commercial revolution can deflect. On the steppes to the north and west, a new force is gathering, one that will not negotiate, will not be bought, and will not stop at the river. The Mongols under Kublai Khan press southward through decades of grinding campaign. The last Song loyalists make their final stand at the naval battle of Yarmen in 1279 of the Common Era. When that battle ends, the Song dynasty ends with it, not in a palace coup or a peasant rebellion, but in the open sea, where a dynasty that built the world's most sophisticated economy meets the force that no economy alone can stop. The sea does not hold its dead quietly. At Yarmen, in the winter of 1279 of the Common Era, the last vessels of the Song fleet sink or scatter. A chancellor leaps into the water, carrying the child emperor in his arms, choosing the sea over surrender. With that act, an era closes, not gradually, not through negotiation, but in a single violent morning on the open water south of the Pearl River Delta. What follows is not a vacuum. Kublai Khan has been preparing for governance as long as he has been preparing for conquest. He is not simply a steppe warlord who has ridden into a civilization he does not understand. He has spent decades observing Chinese administrative practice, employing Chinese advisors, and constructing a capital that speaks two languages simultaneously. At Dadu, built on the site of what will become modern Beijing, the palace complex rises with Mongolian great halls oriented toward the open sky alongside Chinese ceremonial gates, tiled rooftops, and walled administrative compounds. The city is planned from the ground upward, its grid laid out with deliberate symmetry, its walls enclosing a population drawn from across the known world. Kublai Khan declares the Yuan Dynasty in 1271 of the Common Era, adopting a Chinese dynastic name drawn from the Book of Changes. The gesture is calculated. He rules as a Mongol Khan and as a Chinese emperor simultaneously, holding two legitimacies in tension. Chinese civil servants continue to staff the lower bureaucracy, but the highest positions are reserved for Mongols and for a category of trusted foreign administrators, Central Asians, Persians, and others, whom the Yuan court places above the native Chinese population in a formal hierarchy of 4 social ranks. It is within this system that a Venetian merchant's son arrives at the Yuan court and enters service under Kublai Khan. Marco Polo, traveling eastward along the Silk Road routes that Mongol pacification has made safer than at any previous moment in history, reaches Dadu and remains for roughly 17 years. His later account describes Hangzhou, the former Song capital, as the greatest city on earth, a place of canals, silk merchants, pleasure gardens, and a population he estimates in the millions. Whether every detail is precise matters less than what his account reveals. That China under the Yuan remains a civilization of staggering wealth and complexity, even under foreign rule. The Grand Canal is extended and deepened under Yuan administration, linking the grain-producing Yangtze Delta directly to Dadu in the north. Grain barges move northward in continuous procession. Paper currency, inherited from the Song, circulates across the empire, but the Yuan issues it without the fiscal discipline that kept Song monetary policy stable. Over decades, inflation erodes the currency's value. Merchants begin refusing it. The economic confidence that paper money requires dissolves slowly, then rapidly. Kublai Khan reaches outward beyond China's borders with ambitions that exceed even his grandfather's. 2 invasion fleets sail for Japan in 1274 and again in 1281 of the Common Era. Both are destroyed by typhoons that Japanese memory will name divine winds. Campaigns into Vietnam and Java exhaust resources without producing lasting conquest. The empire's edges begin to fray before its center does. Plague travels the Mongol trade routes in the 1300s of the Common Era, moving westward toward Europe and inward through Chinese provinces simultaneously. Population falls. Harvests fail along the Yellow River as flood management, long dependent on organized state labor, deteriorates under a weakening administration. In 1351 of the Common Era, the Red Turban Rebellion ignites across central China, a movement mixing millenarian Buddhist prophecy with the raw fury of starving peasants. Its armies move northward through provinces where Yuan authority has already become a formality. Among the rebel commanders, a man of the lowest origins rises with exceptional speed. Zhou Yuanzhang, born to a landless peasant family in Anhui province, orphaned by famine, briefly a Buddhist novice, becomes a military leader of extraordinary discipline and strategic clarity. His forces consolidate where others fragment. In 1368 of the Common Era, his armies enter Dadu. The last Yuan emperor flees northward onto the steppe, returning to the grasslands from which his dynasty came. The Mongol interlude lasts less than a century in China proper, but its consequences reach further than its duration suggests. The Grand Canal it extended will carry grain for 5 more centuries. The capital it built at Dadu will become Beijing, the city that every subsequent dynasty will choose as its center. And the world it briefly connected, linking China to Persia, to Russia, to the Mediterranean, will leave a memory of openness that later dynasties will alternately pursue and fear. The man who drives the Mongols northward does not come from aristocracy or inherited power. Zhou Yuanzhang is born into a family of tenant farmers in Anhui province, orphaned by famine and plague in his youth, trained briefly as a Buddhist novice before joining the rebellion that would remake China. His dynasty, which he names Ming, meaning brightness, carries within its founding the memory of poverty and disorder. It will spend the next 2.5 centuries building permanence against the possibility of collapse. The early Ming capital sits at Nanjing, on the southern bank of the Yangtze. Zhou Yuanzhang, who rules as the Hongwu Emperor, governs with a combination of administrative rigor and deep suspicion. He abolishes the position of prime minister entirely, concentrating authority in the emperor's own hands. He rebuilds the examination system, restores Confucian ritual, and pursues a vision of agrarian stability, a China of self-sufficient farming communities bound to the land and to the state. The chaos of the Yuan period will not return if discipline holds. It does not hold perfectly. After Hongwu's death, a succession struggle tears through the imperial family. His 4th son, Zhu Di, marches on Nanjing, defeats his nephew, and seizes the throne. He rules as the Yongle Emperor, and his reign reshapes the physical face of China more dramatically than any ruler since the first emperor. In 1403 of the Common Era, he orders the construction of a new imperial capital in the north, on the foundations of the Yuan city of Dadu. What rises over the following 2 decades is the Forbidden City. The scale of its construction defies easy comprehension. Roughly 1 million laborers work across the site. Timber arrives from the forests of Sichuan and Yunnan. floated down rivers and hauled across plains. Marble comes from quarries outside Beijing, dragged on sledges over roads deliberately flooded and frozen in winter to reduce friction. The complex that emerges contains 980 buildings arranged along a central axis running precisely north to south. Its outer walls stretch nearly 8 kilometers in circumference. The Meridian Gate at its southern entrance rises above a broad plaza where officials assemble before dawn. The Hall of Supreme Harmony, where the emperor receives the court on great ceremonial occasions, sits elevated on a 3-tiered marble terrace, its yellow glazed roof tiles visible from the surrounding city's lower rooftops. The Yongle Emperor moves the capital here in 1421 of the Common Era. Beijing will remain China's capital, with one brief interruption, for the next 6 centuries. Beyond the capital, the Yongle Emperor pursues ambitions that reach to the horizon of the known world. He commissions a fleet unlike anything previously assembled. Its admiral is Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan province, a man of immense organizational capacity and physical presence. Between 1405 and 1433 of the Common Era, Zheng He leads 7 voyages across the South China Sea, through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, along the Arabian coast, and down the eastern shore of Africa as far as present-day Kenya. His largest vessels, the so-called treasure ships, measure approximately 130 meters in length, dwarfing the Portuguese caravels that will round Africa's southern cape decades later. The fleets carry silk, porcelain, and copper coins outward, and return with exotic animals, foreign ambassadors, and tribute acknowledgements from dozens of kingdoms. A giraffe arrives in Nanjing, interpreted by court scholars as a qilin, a mythological creature signaling imperial virtue. The voyages end after 1433 of the Common Era. Confucian officials at court argue that maritime expansion drains resources, disrupts agrarian order, and serves no legitimate imperial purpose. The great ships are allowed to rot. The records of the voyages are suppressed or destroyed. China turns inward. But the Ming Dynasty does not abandon its frontiers. Along the northern border, the threat of Mongol resurgence remains real. The response is stone and brick. The Great Wall, which existed in earlier earthen and tamped soil forms since the Qin period, is rebuilt across its entire length in fired brick and cut stone during the Ming centuries. Watchtowers rise at regular intervals along Hebei ridgelines, each within signaling distance of the next. The wall in its Ming form stretches over 21,000 kilometers. It is not simply a defensive barrier. It is a statement, a line drawn between the agricultural world and the steppe, between the civilization that the Ming Dynasty believes itself to embody and the disorder it refuses to absorb. In Jingdezhen, kilns fire the blue and white porcelain that will travel along trade routes to Persia, to Ottoman palaces, to European collections. In examination halls across the empire, candidates bend over paper and compose the 8-legged essays that determine their place in the imperial bureaucracy. In the libraries of Beijing, 2,000 scholars compiled the Yongle Encyclopedia, 11,000 volumes recording the sum of Chinese literary and philosophical knowledge. The Ming Dynasty does not merely govern. It preserves, constructs, and projects, building a civilization that intends to last. Behind the walls of the Forbidden City, behind the examination halls and the treasure fleets and the encyclopedia projects, another China exists. It is quieter, older, and far more numerous. It is the China of the flooded paddy field and the canal barge, the incense stick and the inkstone, the draw loom and the household altar. It is the China that feeds the dynasty, staffs its armies, pays its taxes, and outlasts every emperor who claims the mandate of heaven. In the Jiangnan lowlands south of the Yangtze, where the land lies flat and wet, and the sky reflects in standing water between rows of transplanted rice seedlings, the agricultural year governs everything. By the 16th century of the Common Era, the Ming dynasty's population has reached 200 million people, and roughly 9 in every 10 of them work the land. The farming calendar does not accommodate the concerns of the capital. Seedlings must be transferred from nursery beds to flooded paddies in late spring, bent low over water for hours each day. The harvest must come before the autumn rains. The tax collector arrives regardless of the yield. The Grand Canal, stretching more than 1,700 kilometers from Hangzhou northward to Beijing, is the circulatory system of this agricultural empire. Along its banks at Yangzhou, barge traffic moves in both directions without pause. Grain shipments heading north, silk and ceramic goods heading south, merchants and officials and pilgrims sharing the same slow waterway. The canal carries 4 million shi of grain annually to the capital, sustaining the court, the garrison, and the bureaucracy that governs from the north. The men who pole and haul these barges live aboard them for months at a time, sleeping beneath low wooden canopies, cooking over clay braziers at the stern. In Suzhou, the silk industry operates on draw looms that require 2 workers to produce a single patterned length of fabric, one seated at the loom controlling the weft, one perched above operating the drawstrings that lift individual warp threads into pattern. The work is slow, precise, and relentless. A single bolt of brocade may take weeks to complete. The finished cloth travels outward through merchant networks to Beijing, to the Persian trade, to the warehouses of Jingdezhen merchants who deal in luxury goods for the imperial court, and the gentry households that surround it. The examination system casts a long shadow over every family with ambitions beyond the field. The path from county school to the Qin Shi degree, the highest level of the civil examinations, requires mastery of the classical canon, years of preparation, and success through 3 ascending levels of testing. The system produces roughly 300 Qin Shi degree holders per year across the entire empire, out of a population of 200 million. The odds are severe. Candidates spend years, sometimes decades, preparing. Some sit the examinations well into middle age. The county examination hall, with its rows of individual cells barely wide enough to turn around in, is where ambition meets discipline in its most concentrated form. An inkstone is ground, a brush is prepared, and the 8-legged essay begins. Within the household, Confucian order structures every relationship. Women in gentry families manage domestic economies of considerable complexity, overseeing servants, maintaining accounts, supervising the education of young children, and tending the household altar where ancestor tablets receive daily offerings of incense and food. In wealthier households, the practice of foot binding, which has spread through the gentry and merchant classes since the Song period, shapes the physical lives of women from early childhood. Popular religion weaves through daily life without contradiction. The same household might honor Confucian ancestors at the altar, seek protection from a Taoist deity at the local temple, and make offerings at a Buddhist shrine during festival season. In Nanjing street markets, vendors sell steamed buns, noodle soups, and roasted meats from portable stalls. The popular novels of the Ming period, Journey to the West, Water Margin, and The Golden Lotus, circulate through the same urban networks that carry silk and grain, reaching readers and listeners across social boundaries. The dynasty that builds the Forbidden City and sends treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean is sustained, at its foundation, by this vast, textured, largely unrecorded world of ordinary life. The dynasty that sustains ordinary life for 2 centuries does not fall to a foreign empire or a rival civilization. It falls to its own exhaustion. By the early 17th century, the Ming court is hollowed from within. Eunuch factions controlling palace access, silver shortages disrupting the tax system, drought and famine spreading across the North China Plain, and Manchu forces pressing against the northeastern frontier with increasing confidence. The peasant rebellions that erupt across Shanxi and Henan are not isolated uprisings. They are the accumulated weight of a system that has stopped functioning. In April of 1644 of the Common Era, a rebel commander named Li Zicheng leads his armies into Beijing. The last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, walks to Coal Hill behind the Forbidden City and hangs himself from a locust tree, reportedly leaving a note asking that his body be mutilated but his people spared. The palace that took 15 years to build and housed 24 emperors falls without a siege. North of the Great Wall, the Manchu leadership has been watching. The Manchu people, descendants of the Jurchen tribes who once challenged the Song, have spent decades building a parallel state, their own bureaucracy, their own examination system adapted from Chinese models, their own military structure organized into 8 banner formations that combine cavalry, infantry, and artillery. When a Ming general named Wu Sangui opens the Shanhai Pass Gate in June of 1644, inviting Manchu forces south to help expel the rebels, the decision reshapes the next 2.5 centuries of Chinese history. The Manchu bannermen who ride through Shanhai Pass do not simply replace one dynasty with another. They establish something more complex, a dual system of governance in which Manchu and Chinese officials serve alongside each other in the imperial bureaucracy, in which the Confucian examination system continues producing Chinese administrators, but in which ultimate military and political authority rests with the Manchu ruling house. Chinese men are required to adopt the Manchu queue hairstyle as a mark of submission, a demand that provokes fierce resistance in southern cities before compliance becomes enforced. The Qing dynasty's consolidation takes decades. Southern Ming loyalist regimes hold out in Fujian, Guangdong, and Yunnan. The pirate and resistance leader Koxinga controls Taiwan until 1662 of the Common Era. But the Kangxi Emperor, who begins his personal reign in 1661 and governs for 61 years, proves to be one of the most capable rulers in Chinese history. He suppresses the revolt of the 3 feudatories, a rebellion by 3 powerful Chinese generals who had helped the Qing conquer the south between 1673 and 1681. He incorporates Taiwan in 1683. He negotiates the Treaty of Nerchinsk with Russia in 1689, the first treaty China concludes with a European power on roughly equal terms, defining the northeastern border along the Amur River. Kangshi's southern inspection tours move through the Yangtze Delta like a slow procession of state authority made visible, the emperor traveling by barge along the Grand Canal, receiving local officials, examining flood control works, and demonstrating that Manchu rule has absorbed the rhythms of Chinese governance. Jesuit missionaries serve at his court as astronomers, mathematicians, and painters, their presence reflecting a moment of cautious intellectual exchange before later emperors restrict Christian activity. Under the Yongzheng Emperor, who reigns from 1722 to 1735, the administrative machinery tightens. A secret memorial system allows provincial officials to report directly to the emperor, bypassing the formal bureaucracy and giving the throne unprecedented information about conditions across the empire. Under the Qianlong Emperor, who reigns from 1735 to 1796 and lives to 89, the empire reaches its greatest territorial extent. 10 military campaigns push Qing borders into Xinjiang, Tibet, Nepal, and Burma. The summer palace outside Beijing becomes a landscape of pavilions, lakes, and garden architecture that embodies imperial confidence at its height. By 1700, the population has grown to perhaps 150 million. By 1800, it approaches 400 million. The agricultural system that feeds this population depends on New World crops, maize, sweet potato, and peanuts introduced through maritime trade, spreading into marginal lands that older grain varieties could not sustain. But the same population growth that demonstrates dynastic success begins to strain the land, the bureaucracy, and the granary reserves. The White Lotus Rebellion of 1796 to 1804 signals that the machinery is beginning to slip. The High Qing moment, brilliant and vast, carries within it the pressures that will define the century to come. The pressure that builds beneath the High Qing surface does not announce itself with a single rupture. It accumulates across decades, arriving first in the form of silver, then smoke, then warships anchored in river mouths where no foreign vessel had ever been permitted to rest. For generations, European merchants have sought access to Chinese markets with a persistence that Qing officials regard as both tiresome and manageable. The Canton system, established in the 18th century, confines all foreign trade to a single port, Guangzhou, where licensed merchant guilds called the Kohong mediate every transaction. Tea, silk, and porcelain flow outward in vast quantities. Silver flows inward because China produces what the world desires and desires little of what the world produces. The trade imbalance troubles British merchants and the British East India Company deeply. Their solution arrives from the poppy fields of Bengal. Opium, processed in East India Company warehouses along the Hooghly River at Calcutta, begins moving into Chinese coastal waters through private traders operating with the company's quiet sanction. By the 1830s, an estimated 12 million Chinese are addicted. Silver that once flowed into China now flows outward to pay for the drug. The Qing treasury feels the reversal. The social fabric of port cities and inland towns begins to fray. In 1839, the Daoguang Emperor appoints Commissioner Lin Zexu to end the trade by force of law. Lin arrives in Guangzhou with imperial authority and moral conviction. He confiscates and destroys approximately 1,200 tons of opium at Human, dissolving it in saltwater trenches dug along the Pearl River estuary. He writes a letter to Queen Victoria appealing to conscience and natural law. The letter receives no reply. British warships arrive instead, The First Opium War exposes the full distance between Qing military capacity and British industrial firepower. Qing coastal forts, armed with bronze cannon cast in earlier centuries, face Royal Navy steam-powered gunboats that can navigate shallow rivers and deliver broadsides with devastating accuracy. British forces move northward along the coast, seizing Zhoushan, threatening the Yangtze, and cutting the Grand Canal's access to Beijing. The Qing court, unable to sustain resistance, negotiates. The Treaty of Nanking, signed aboard the British warship Cornwallis in 1842, is unlike any agreement the Qing dynasty has previously concluded. It cedes Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity. It opens 5 treaty ports, Guangzhou, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, to foreign residents and trade. It imposes an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. It grants extraterritoriality, meaning British subjects in China answer to British courts, not Chinese law. The mandate of heaven does not speak of such terms. No philosophical framework within the Confucian order has prepared the court for the concept of legal equality between the empire and a foreign trading company. The Second Opium War follows in 1856, when a dispute over a ship's registration gives Britain and France the pretext for renewed military pressure. Anglo-French forces stormed the Taku forts guarding the high river approach to Tianjin. In 1860, they marched to Beijing itself and burned the old summer palace, the Yuan, a complex of gardens and pavilions that Jesuit architects had helped design for the Qianlong emperor. The smoke rising over the imperial gardens carries a meaning that no treaty language can fully contain. While foreign pressure arrives from the coast, an internal catastrophe of even greater scale erupts from within. Hong Xiuquan, a failed examination candidate from Guangdong province who believes himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ, launches the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom movement in 1850. His armies sweep northward, capturing Nanjing in 1853 and holding it as their capital for 11 years. The Taiping Rebellion, sustained by genuine peasant grievance and millenarian religious fervor, becomes the deadliest civil war in recorded history. Estimates of the dead range from 20 million to 30 million people. Cities across Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Anhui, and Jiangxi are reduced to ruins. The Qing dynasty survives only because regional commanders, most notably Zheng Guofan with his Xiang army, build new provincial military forces that the central government can no longer supply itself. The dynasty that emerges from the 1860s is visibly diminished. The self-strengthening movement attempts to graft Western military technology onto Confucian institutional foundations, building arsenals at Shanghai and Fuzhou, launching a modern navy, and sending students abroad. But the movement's limits become catastrophic in 1894, when Japan, itself recently transformed by the Meiji Restoration, defeats Qing forces in Korea and sinks the Beiyang fleet at the Battle of the Yalu River. The Treaty of Shimonoseki of 1895 forces China to cede Taiwan and the Pescadores, recognize Korean independence from Chinese suzerainty, and pay a further indemnity. The defeat by Japan, a civilization that had long looked to China as its cultural source, strikes the educated class with a particular force that the European wars had not. The Boxer Uprising of 1900, a movement of rural martial arts practitioners who believe themselves immune to foreign bullets, attacks missionaries and Chinese Christians before besieging the foreign legation quarter in Beijing for 55 days. An 8-nation alliance, including Britain, France, Germany, Russia, the United States, Japan, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, relieves the legations and occupies Beijing. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposes an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, to be paid over 39 years with interest. Empress Dowager Cixi, who had briefly supported the Boxers, returns to Beijing in a procession that carries the full weight of a dynasty that has run out of answers. The new policies reforms that follow, abolishing the examination system in 1905, drafting a constitution, reorganizing the army, arrive too late to restore what the century has taken. The reforms arrive too late, and everyone who matters knows it. The new policies of the final Qing years, abolishing the examination system, drafting constitutional frameworks, reorganizing provincial armies, produce not stability, but expectation. They teach a generation that change is possible without delivering the change itself. Across the treaty ports, in Tokyo universities where Chinese students study on government scholarships, in the reading rooms of Shanghai's foreign concessions, the question shifts from whether the dynasty can be reformed to whether it deserves to survive at all. The answer comes on the 10th of October, 1911, in Wuhan. An accidental explosion in a revolutionary cell's bomb-making workshop forces the conspirators' hand before they are ready. Soldiers of the new army garrison, many already sympathetic to Republican ideas, mutiny rather than face arrest. By morning, the Wuchang military headquarters has fallen to its own troops. Within weeks, province after province declares independence from the Qing court. Revolutionary soldiers move through Wuhan streets, cutting off the Manchu queue, the braided pigtail that the Qing had imposed on Han men as a mark of submission 2.5 centuries earlier. The cutting of the queue is not merely a gesture. It is a physical severing from an entire political order. Sun Yat-sen, the movement's most prominent voice, is in the United States raising funds when the uprising begins. He returns to take the provisional presidency of the new Republic of China, inaugurated in Nanjing on the 1st of January, 1912. 6 weeks later, on the 12th of February, the 6-year-old Emperor Puyi abdicates. The edict is brief. 2,000 years of imperial rule ends not in battle, but in a document signed by an Empress Dowager on behalf of a child who does not yet understand what has been surrendered. Power does not flow cleanly to the Republic. Sun Yat-sen steps aside almost immediately, yielding the presidency to Yuan Shikai, the most powerful military commander in China, the man whose loyalty the Qing court had depended upon and who had withheld it at the decisive moment. Yuan consolidates authority in Beijing, dissolves the new parliament, and by 1915 attempts to restore the monarchy with himself as emperor. The attempt collapses under opposition from his own generals. Yuan dies in 1916, and with him goes any pretense of unified republican governance. What follows is the warlord era. China fractures into competing military satrapies, each controlled by a commander with his own army, his own tax base, and his own foreign weapons suppliers. Across the Yellow River plains, armies march and countermarch, fighting wars that shift provincial boundaries without resolving anything. Beijing changes hands repeatedly. The Republic's institutions exist on paper, while actual authority belongs to whoever commands the nearest garrison. In May of 1919, the fragmentation acquires a new dimension. The Paris Peace Conference awards Germany's former concessions in Shandong province not to China, but to Japan, despite China having entered the war on the Allied side. Beijing University students pour into the streets in protest. The demonstrations spread to Shanghai, Tianjin, and beyond. The May 4th movement, as it becomes known, is more than a protest against a treaty. It is a generational reckoning with the question of what China must become, a debate between those who look to Western liberalism, those drawn to anarchism, and those beginning to read the works of Marx and Lenin with urgent attention. In July of 1921, 13 delegates gather in a girls' school in Shanghai's French concession for the founding Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. Among them is a young man from Hunan province named Mao Zedong. The meeting is interrupted by a police informant and continues on a boat on South Lake in Zhejiang. The party that emerges has fewer than 60 members. Within 3 years, following guidance from the Communist International in Moscow, it enters a formal alliance, the First United Front, with Sun Yat-sen's nationalist party, the Kuomintang. Sun dies in 1925, before seeing what the alliance will produce. His successor, Chiang Kai-shek, builds the Whampoa Military Academy outside Guangzhou, training officers for the army that will attempt to reunify China by force. The cadets drill in the subtropical heat, preparing for a campaign that will transform the country and eventually tear the alliance apart. The cadets who train at Whampoa do not wait long. In the summer of 1926, the Northern Expedition begins. Nationalist armies move northward from Guangzhou in columns of khaki and determination, crossing the hills of Hunan and Jiangxi, absorbing warlord forces and defeating others in pitched battles across the Central Plains. The campaign is swift and violent. By the spring of 1927, nationalist forces have reached the Yangtze Valley, and Shanghai, the great treaty port, the financial capital of foreign-controlled China, falls without a major battle. Workers' militias organized by communist organizers have already seized much of the city from within. Then the alliance breaks. On the 12th of April, 1927, Chiang Kai-shek turns on his communist partners. Armed gangs move through Shanghai's neighborhoods before dawn, hunting union leaders and party members. Thousands are killed in the following days and weeks. The purge spreads to other cities. The First United Front is finished. The communists who survive scatter into the countryside, into mountain strongholds, into the margins of a country that has no safe center for them. In the mountains of Jiangxi province, Mao Zedong and Zhou establish a rural base. The Chinese Soviet Republic is proclaimed in 1931, a state within a state, governing peasant communities through land redistribution and political mobilization. Chiang Kai-shek launches 5 successive encirclement campaigns to destroy it. The 5th, in 1934, succeeds in tightening the noose. Facing annihilation, the communist forces break out westward in October of that year. What follows is one of the most grueling retreats in military history. The Long March carries roughly 86,000 soldiers and cadres across 9,000 kilometers of some of China's most forbidding terrain, through Guizhou's karst mountains, across the Luding Chain Bridge over the Dadu River under fire, through the frozen grasslands of the Tibetan Plateau, and northward into the Loess highlands of Shanxi. By the time the survivors reach Yan'an in October of 1935, fewer than 8,000 remain. The march destroys the army as a fighting force and simultaneously transforms it into a legend. Mao Zedong emerges from it as the undisputed leader of the Chinese Communist Party. The Japanese invasion that begins in earnest in July of 1937 changes everything. Japanese forces advance rapidly from Manchuria, which they have occupied since 1931, southward into the Chinese heartland. Nanjing, the nationalist capital, falls in December of 1937. What follows in that city over the next 6 weeks is a catastrophe of organized violence. Estimates of those killed range from 200,000 to 300,000. The city burns. The nationalist government retreats westward up the Yangtze to Chongqing, a city of steep hills and river fog that becomes China's wartime capital for 8 years. Chongqing endures years of Japanese aerial bombardment. The city's stone and timber buildings burn repeatedly. Refugees pour in from the occupied east. Factories are dismantled and shipped inland piece by piece. The nationalist government governs a truncated, exhausted country while simultaneously watching the communists rebuild their strength in Yan'an, training a new army and deepening their roots among the rural population of northern China. Japan surrenders in August of 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The 8-year war has cost China an estimated 14 to 20 million lives. Mao and Chiang meet in Chongqing that same autumn, photographed together, toasting a peace that neither intends to honor. Within months, civil war resumes across Manchuria and the northern plains. The final phase is rapid beyond expectation. The People's Liberation Army, reorganized and supplied in part from captured Japanese weapons, defeats nationalist forces in a series of decisive campaigns between 1947 and 1949. Manchuria falls. Tianjin and Beijing fall. The Yangtze crossing comes on the 23rd of April, 1949, as Liberation Army soldiers row across the great river on wooden boats and junks under covering fire, landing on the southern bank and advancing toward Nanjing. The nationalist government evacuates to Taiwan, carrying the national treasury, the Palace Museum's collections, and the remnants of its military. On the 1st of October, 1949, Mao Zedong stands above Tiananmen Gate and proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China. The century of humiliation, in the telling that will define the new state's identity, is declared over. A new chapter begins on the same ancient ground. The new state inherits a country shattered by a century of war, famine, and foreign occupation. The cities are damaged, the railways broken, the treasury nearly empty. But the party that takes power in 1949 carries something the previous governments never possessed in full: a disciplined organization reaching into every village, every work unit, every neighborhood committee across a country of 500 million people. The first transformation comes to the countryside. In 1950, the land reform law redistributes the holdings of landlords and wealthy farmers to the rural poor. In village squares across Hunan, Sichuan, and Hebei, land deeds change hands. The process is not gentle. Landlords are denounced in public struggle sessions, their property seized, their social standing destroyed. Hundreds of thousands are executed. For the peasants who receive land, the revolution delivers what generations of uprisings never could. For those on the wrong side of the new classifications, it brings ruin. The Korean War arrives before the land reform is complete. In October of 1950, Chinese People's Volunteer Army forces cross the Yalu River into Korea, entering a conflict that had begun as a civil war on the peninsula and escalated into a confrontation between the United States and the new People's Republic. The Chinese intervention pushes United Nations forces back from the Chinese border. The fighting stabilizes near the 38th parallel. An armistice is signed in 1953. China loses an estimated 180,000 soldiers. The war consolidates the new state's identity as a power willing to fight the world's strongest military to a standstill. Through the early 1950s, Soviet advisors arrive in Beijing and Shanghai, bringing industrial blueprints, technical manuals, and the model of centralized planning. Factories rise in Manchuria. Steel production climbs. The first 5-year plan, modeled on Soviet methods, produces genuine industrial growth. The alliance with Moscow shapes the early People's Republic in its architecture, its universities, and its bureaucratic culture. In 1957, Mao invites criticism under the 100 Flowers campaign, encouraging intellectuals to speak openly about the party's shortcomings. When criticism proves sharper than expected, the invitation is withdrawn. The anti-rightist campaign that follows labels hundreds of thousands of intellectuals as enemies, sending them to labor camps or remote provinces. The space for honest counsel within the system narrows severely. What follows is catastrophe on a scale that strains comprehension. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, attempts to transform China into an industrial and agricultural powerhouse within years. Peasants are organized into vast people's communes. Backyard steel furnaces appear in village courtyards across the country, melting down farm tools and cooking pots to meet production quotas. Grain output figures are falsified upward at every level of the reporting chain. Officials who report failure are punished. The harvests of 1959, 1960, and 1961 collapse. Grain is still exported while the countryside starves. Between 15 and 55 million people die of famine. It is among the deadliest peacetime catastrophes in recorded history. The Sino-Soviet split deepens through the early 1960s as Mao and Soviet Premier Khrushchev clash over ideology and leadership of the communist world. Soviet advisors withdraw, taking their blueprints with them. China develops its own nuclear weapon, testing it successfully in 1964. Then comes the Cultural Revolution. In May of 1966, Mao mobilizes the youth of China against what he calls bourgeois elements within the party and society. Red Guards, students and young workers carrying small red books of Mao's quotations pour into the streets of Beijing and every major city. Universities close, temples, libraries, and cultural artifacts are destroyed. Teachers, professors, and party officials are dragged before struggle sessions, forced to wear dunce caps, beaten, and sent to labor camps or remote villages for re-education. The violence is decentralized and vast. Rival Red Guard factions fight each other in the streets. The army eventually imposes order, but the destruction of institutions, expertise, and cultural memory continues for a decade. Lin Biao, designated Mao's successor, dies in a plane crash over Mongolia in 1971 under circumstances that remain disputed. The Gang of Four, led by Mao's wife Jiang Qing, controls cultural and political life through the mid-1970s. On the 9th of September 1976, Mao Zedong dies. Within weeks, the Gang of Four is arrested. The decade of the Cultural Revolution closes, leaving behind a generation of lost education, broken institutions, and a country that must now reckon with what it has done to itself. The reckoning comes quietly at first. In the months after Mao's death, the party moves cautiously, testing the boundaries of what can be said, what can be undone, what can be admitted. The Gang of Four stands trial. The verdict, when it comes, is both judicial and historical, an acknowledgement that the decade of the Cultural Revolution was not an aberration imposed from outside, but a catastrophe generated from within the system itself. Into this careful, uncertain atmosphere steps a figure who had been purged twice and survived both times. Deng Xiaoping is short, pragmatic, and possessed of a patience that decades of political danger have only deepened. By December of 1978, at the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee, he has consolidated enough support to redirect the entire trajectory of the People's Republic. The meeting does not announce a revolution. It announces a shift in priorities from class struggle to economic construction. The difference in practice is total. The first experiments begin in the countryside. In Anhui province, farmers in the village of Xiaogang secretly divide collective land among individual households, each family taking responsibility for its own plot and its own harvest. The results are immediate and dramatic. Output rises, the experiment spreads. The household responsibility system, formalized across China by the early 1980s, dismantles the commune structure that had organized rural life since the Great Leap Forward. Hundreds of millions of farmers return to working land they can call, in practical terms, their own. Along the southern coast, a different experiment takes shape. 4 special economic zones are established in 1980: Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen. Shenzhen, a fishing settlement bordering Hong Kong, becomes the most visible symbol of what reform means in physical terms. Within a decade, its skyline rises from low tile rooftops to towers of glass and steel. Factories multiply across its grid of new streets. Workers arrive from every province, carrying little more than the expectation of wages. The Pearl River Delta transforms into the manufacturing engine of the world. Deng travels to Washington in 1979, meeting President Jimmy Carter and signaling to the world that China is open, not for ideology, but for investment, technology, and trade. The image of this small, composed man navigating the protocols of American diplomacy carries a message that no speech could fully articulate. China is returning to the world on its own terms, but it is returning. The growth is real and rapid. And then, in the spring of 1989, the contradictions of reform surface in Tiananmen Square. Students gather to mourn the death of reformist leader Hu Yaobang and remain to demand accountability, transparency, and political change. The protests grow for weeks, drawing workers and citizens from across Beijing. On the 4th of June, the army moves. Tanks advance along Chang'an Avenue. The square is cleared. The precise number of those killed remains unknown and officially suppressed. The crackdown freezes reform for nearly 3 years. Then, in January and February of 1992, Deng undertakes what becomes known as the Southern Tour, traveling to Shenzhen, Zhuhai, and Shanghai, delivering speeches that insist the direction of reform is correct and must continue. The tour breaks the political paralysis. Investment accelerates. The Pudong district of Shanghai, farmland on the eastern bank of the Huangpu River, begins its transformation into a forest of towers that will eventually include some of the tallest buildings on Earth. Through the 1990s, China becomes the world's factory. Export containers move through Guangzhou and Shanghai in volumes that reshape global supply chains. The gross domestic product grows from 149 billion United States dollars in 1978 to 1.2 trillion by the year 2000. 400 million people are lifted from poverty in a span of 2 decades, a scale of material transformation without precedent in recorded history. In December of 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization, completing its integration into the global economic order that its reforms had been building toward for a generation. The entry into the World Trade Organization does not simply open markets. It opens an era. Through the first decade of the 21st century, China's integration into the global economy accelerates at a pace that surprises even those who designed the reforms. Factories multiply across the Pearl River Delta and the Yangtze Corridor. Coastal cities expand inland. The highway network stretches toward provinces that had remained largely agricultural for centuries. A country that once measured its ambitions in survival now measures them in infrastructure, output, and reach. In August of 2008, Beijing places itself at the center of the world's attention. The National Stadium, its interlocking steel beams forming the shape that will give it the name Bird's Nest, fills with 80,000 spectators for the opening ceremony of the Summer Olympic Games. The performance that unfolds across the stadium floor draws on 5,000 years of civilization. Drummers in Han Dynasty formations, scroll painters recreating classical landscapes, a child carried aloft as if born by history itself. The message is deliberate and unmistakable. China has returned, and it intends to be seen. 2 months later, the global financial crisis originating in American credit markets sends shockwaves through every major economy. Western banks contract. Growth slows across Europe and North America. China, drawing on its enormous foreign currency reserves and state-directed investment capacity, launches a stimulus program of nearly 600 billion United States dollars, sustaining construction, infrastructure, and employment at a moment when much of the world is pulling back. By 2010, China's gross domestic product surpasses Japan's, making it the world's second-largest economy. The shift in global economic weight, long anticipated, has arrived. The high-speed rail network expands with a speed that mirrors the broader transformation. Lines connect Beijing to Shanghai, Guangzhou to Wuhan, Chengdu to Kunming. By the early 2020s, the network spans more than 40,000 kilometers, longer than the rest of the world's high-speed rail combined. Passengers move between cities that once required overnight journeys in a matter of hours. The physical landscape of China is being rewritten in concrete, steel, and electrified track. In November of 2012, Xi Jinping becomes General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. His consolidation of authority over the following years is methodical and comprehensive. An anti-corruption campaign removes thousands of officials at every level of government. Constitutional amendments in 2018 remove the 2-term limit on the presidency. The party reasserts its presence in universities, media, technology companies, and civil society in ways not seen since the reform era began. In September of 2013, Xi announces what will become the defining foreign policy project of his leadership. The Belt and Road Initiative, drawing its name from the ancient Silk Road, proposes a vast network of infrastructure investment connecting China to Central Asia, South Asia, East Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Ports are built or expanded in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Kenya, and Greece. Railways cross the highlands of Laos and the plains of Kazakhstan. The scale of the undertaking has no modern precedent in deliberate, state-directed foreign investment. In the South China Sea, construction of another kind proceeds on disputed reefs and shoals. Satellite imagery reveals artificial islands rising from shallow water, equipped with runways, radar installations, and port facilities. Neighboring states and the United States contest these claims. An international tribunal rules against China's territorial assertions in 2016. Beijing does not recognize the ruling. The islands remain. In 2019, protests erupt across Hong Kong over a proposed extradition bill that demonstrators fear would expose residents to mainland Chinese jurisdiction. The movement grows through the summer and autumn, filling streets with hundreds of thousands of people. In 2020, Beijing imposes a national security law that fundamentally alters Hong Kong's political landscape, effectively ending the broad civil liberties that had distinguished the territory since the handover of 1997. In late 2019, a novel respiratory illness emerges in Wuhan, a city of 11 million in central China's Hubei province. By January of 2020, the city is placed under a lockdown of unprecedented scale. The pathogen spreads beyond China's borders within weeks, becoming a global pandemic. China's initial response draws international criticism, followed by the deployment of mass testing, quarantine infrastructure, and eventually domestic vaccines at a scale only a state of China's organizational capacity could attempt. In July of 2020, China launches Tianwen-1, its first independent mission to Mars. The spacecraft carries an orbiter, a lander, and a rover. It reaches Martian orbit in February of 2021 and successfully deploys its rover onto the surface in May. A civilization that began measuring the heavens with bronze instruments along the Yellow River now sends its instruments beyond the inner solar system. The arc from oracle bones to orbital mechanics spans more than 3,000 years of unbroken inquiry into the nature of the world and humanity's place within it. The Yellow River rises in the highlands of Qinghai, where the plateau meets the sky at an elevation of more than 4,000 meters. At its source, the water moves slowly, gathering in shallow lakes among grasslands that have changed little across the millennia. From this quiet origin, it descends through Loess canyons, across the North China Plain, and into the sea, carrying with it the sediment of a civilization that has been building, breaking, and rebuilding itself for more than 5,000 years. That continuity is not accidental. It is the product of choices made and remade across generations. Choices about how to govern, how to remember, how to transmit knowledge, and how to define what it means to belong to something larger than any single dynasty or ruler. The writing system first scratched onto oracle bones at Anyang more than 3,200 years ago still moves across the pages of newspapers in Shanghai and Beijing today. The characters have evolved in form, but their structural logic, their connection to meaning through visual composition rather than phonetic transcription, remains unbroken. No other writing system in continuous use on Earth carries so long an uninterrupted history. The Forbidden City stands at the center of Beijing, as it has stood since the Yongle Emperor completed it in the early 15th century. Its golden rooftops catch the morning light in the same way they caught it when Ming emperors received tribute missions from across Asia. The geometry of the complex, its axial symmetry, its graduated sequence of gates and courtyards, its careful calibration of human scale against imperial grandeur, encodes a philosophy of governance that stretches back through the Zhou concept of the mandate of heaven to the earliest sage kings of cultural memory. The building is not merely architecture. It is an argument about order, legitimacy, and the relationship between heaven and earth that China has been making for 3 millennia. Beneath the fields of Shanxi, the terracotta warriors of the first emperor remain in their excavation pits, still emerging from the soil more than 2,200 years after they were buried. Each face is individual. Each soldier was crafted to accompany a ruler who believed that the empire he had built could be carried into eternity. The empire lasted 15 years. The warriors endure. Along the Grand Canal, cargo barges still move between the cities of the Yangtze Delta and the north, following a waterway first conceived in the 5th century before the Common Era and expanded under the Sui and Yuan dynasties. The canal has been dredged, rerouted, and modernized, but its fundamental purpose, connecting China's agricultural south to its political north, remains what it was when laborers first cut the channel through the Jiangnan Plain. In the cave temples at Dunhuang, where the Silk Road once carried silk and scripture across the Taklamakan Desert, painted bodhisattvas still gaze from walls sealed for centuries. The pigments have faded, but the compositions remain, evidence of a moment when China stood at the center of the known world's exchange of goods, faiths, and ideas. That centrality is returning in a different form. The Belt and Road Initiative, announced in 2013, now extends across more than 140 countries, financing ports, railways, and power infrastructure from Gwadar in Pakistan to Piraeus in Greece. The logic is ancient even when the concrete is new. China has always understood that the routes connecting it to the wider world are instruments of both commerce and influence. The space station Tiangong orbits the Earth, carrying Chinese astronauts through a sky that Chinese astronomers have been reading since the Shang Dynasty recorded solar eclipses on oracle bones. The civilization that invented paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass now leads the world in patents filed, high-speed rail kilometers operated, renewable energy capacity installed, and quantum communication research conducted. More than 1.4 billion people live within its borders, speaking a language that more native speakers use than any other on Earth, belonging to 56 officially recognized ethnic groups within a state that has always defined itself as a civilization first and a nation second. The weight of 5,000 years is not a burden China carries reluctantly. It is a foundation the People's Republic invokes deliberately, in its rhetoric, its architecture, its foreign policy, and its understanding of its own historical position. Dynasties have risen and fallen, borders have contracted and expanded, philosophies have competed and merged, but the idea of China, continuous, adaptive, and oriented toward a future shaped by the memory of an extraordinarily long past, has never disappeared. The river flows on toward the sea, as it always has, carrying the soil of the interior to the edge of the world. Thank you for watching this journey through 5,000 years of Chinese civilization. If this series has moved or inspired you, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next.